Thank you very much. Do you want to come and join us maybe just at this point, and we'll just maybe go straight in, but I'll maybe direct sort of one or two of these sort of first questions in your general direction anyway. The first one here is, do you think it is primarily the owner's own responsibility to learn, or the vet's responsibility to educate owners on infectious diseases and biosecurity?
Well, the simple answer is absolutely both. I mean, but I think it's there's the information out there, and I think what we've really tried to sort of do with this project with Toby is take it from completely the other end and say, okay, what are the behaviours that owners are likely to undertake, or vets or farriers are likely to undertake, that are going to have an impact improving biosecurity? And I think what we know is that the behaviours, there needs to be lots of them. It's not just one golden bullet that's going to solve here. But so we're on that early journey. But without doubt, vets and owners are going to be integral to changing that behaviour in both regards.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, one from Ian Richards. I suspect Ian's maybe going to ask what I think he's going to ask him.
How much? Probably not. Thank you. Excellent presentation. It's a bit like listening to a fantastic episode of In Our Time on Radio 4, those explanations there. The whole thing about influencing human behaviour for animal welfare. And one of the things that struck me from one of the earlier presentations is we do have a role in trying to educate people about their animals, because there is this infantilization, I think I called it. It's not child substitute. There seems to be this push in small animal practice that these things are almost Cabbage Patch dolls. And the interesting behaviour was when the picture of the monkeys swimming and bathing went up and there was laughter in the room. Why? Why do we laugh at that behaviour, which is perfectly normal behaviour? So I think as vets we've got a big role to play, but I'm not sure how to achieve it. What do you think I was going to ask?
I thought you were maybe going to touch on the conversation last night about companion animals. Just what Rolly was had given quite a good example just around biosecurity, in the equine sector. So there was some discussion on one of the Facebook groups last night around the import of pets from overseas, and this idea that people feel that they are rescuing an animal from overseas, and they're actually potentially bringing in a Trojan dog or a Trojan cat or whatever, and it's certainly an area that within BVA that we're looking very carefully at, and we'll have a new sort of policy position kind of coming forward on that. But certainly that whole piece around, it's not necessarily about waiting for the next case of equine infectious anemia or the next case of mouse disease to come into the country, but actually it's some of these ongoing issues around biosecurity that we all probably have a role to play in right across all of the subsectors within the profession. I'll move on to another one of these questions here.
Simon, can I get back on that? Because in a way that was my question. Is the behaviour of the people, as the young lass pointed out in her presentation, what is it that's making them feel sorry for these animals that's bringing them in? There was a piece in the Times some time ago, the latest middle-class trend, adopt an animal from abroad, usually because you feel sorry for it. And how can we change that behaviour? Because it's being exploited, we know full well, by businesses who pose as charities. So we need to know how to change that behaviour.
Well, I mean, it's all of our roles, and I think it comes back to the talk we had this morning, or the question we had this morning about animals in adverts. And I think, the veterinary profession, we've got to speak with a much louder voice. And, this is a communications exercise. And I think maybe from what Toby and Tony talk about, it's where, people know that they don't want to bring an infectious disease into the country and cause a disease outbreak. But it's that sort of rational piece of the 2x2 is very much trumped by the warmth you get from saving an animal from whatever. So I think it is a communications piece, and I think there's some real clever tactics you can implement in that communications piece. But I think as a profession, the veterinary profession, we've got to do more collectively to win that battle, because we're certainly not winning it at the moment.
But I think it is very much about using those tools. It's not necessarily just about saying, you know, if you bring in one of these dogs, it might come in with parvo, and it might come in with a kind of coccus, and it might come in with ticks. It's about that whole communications piece around the whole thing. Lady here.
I'm itching to bring in the aspect of owner compliance and physical and mental frailty. And I think it's something that is often being overlooked, that it's not just the being able to afford things. And I agree that biosecurity is obviously paramount, but what we're seeing is an awful lot of animal welfare issues because of people's mental and physical well-being and the lack of support in the community. So I'd like that to be raised here, and how one can influence the amount of support in the community, because animals are not choosing to be mental health carers. And there's an awful lot of situations where I gather if you have a mental ill health, you're less likely to relinquish your animal. This opens up a huge new field, and I don't want to detract from the important things that are being discussed, but I think we're not actually looking at human vulnerability and owner compliance and the inability to do what we would love them to do.
Any of the speakers like to respond to that one?
It's a tough one, and an area I've really got no expertise in, but I think, I mean, it sounds like a very challenging problem, but one thought that sort of cropped into my mind, which is, as Roddy says, very, very far from a golden bullet. But when we are averse to giving something up that we are accustomed to, I think there's a lot you can learn from the science of habits and sort of addictions and so on. And one quite key insight is that substitution is profoundly easier for people to deal with than just giving something up. So you see this with smoking, for example. People are much more willing to move from cigarettes to e-cigarettes than they would be to quit. So I feel like if you're in a situation where you're trying to encourage someone to relinquish something that they depend upon, don't just think about what can we do to motivate them to get rid of it, but what can we do to make their life easier in the absence of that? What can we substitute those needs, understanding those base needs that they clearly have, and allowing that to be met through some kind of substitution to that, whatever that might be, I don't know. But you need to think of it, in terms of the positive and the negative, I think.
Here's an interesting one. How can we challenge the public perception at the moment that is negative towards many vets? For example, regarding anti-vaccination.
Regarding?
Anti-vaccination. Anti-vax.
Well, the risk of, I feel suddenly isolated. Maybe you guys.
You're the only one that knows anything about it.
It's a communications exercise. I think as a veterinary profession, we are not very good at getting on the front foot. And we know, for all the evils of social media, there are great opportunities for that. So I think as a profession, we do need to come forward because, the threats to the profession through telemedicine and across the piece is significant. And I think we'd be very wrong to think that next year it's going to be any easier. It's not. It's going to be more difficult. So I think collectively we need to come together. As a rather generic answer to the question, but I'm not sure I've got a better tool, but I think it is around communication and how we can speak with one voice more effectively.
Yep. Any other? John?
Thank you. I think to go back to the point about, it's John Fishwick from the BVA, to go back to the point about communicating messages about the way animals are perceived and things like the anti-vaccination campaign. We do work very hard at BVA to get messages out. So with the vaccination thing, we were all ready to go, I think, on Good Morning Britain, and they cancelled us at the last minute. We were all geared up to get that message out, and that has some effect in those sorts of rather worrying publicity events that you see. I think with the way animals are portrayed, which was brought up this morning as well, we have a advertising policy, which is a document for advertisers to use to help inform them so they don't do things which are going to be unkind or cruel to the animals. But we also frequently challenge advertisers when we see animals being used in inappropriate ways. And what I think is really interesting is often, in fact, every time they say we had a vet present and the animal wasn't harmed anyway, which I think we'd fully accept, but it's the message it sends out, it's the way the animal was portrayed. For example, the one I particularly remember is an animal with a child sitting on its back, and it was a dog that was wearing sunglasses and had a child riding around. And they said, oh, no, that was all a CGI, there was no animal involved. But actually, that isn't really the point. It's the way that animal is portrayed, so people think it's quite all right for teenage kids to put sunglasses on their dogs and ride it around the garden. You know, so we do work very, very hard to try and get these messages out on behalf of the profession. It's an almost endless task.
And I certainly don't want to come across as criticising the BVA or anyone else, but I think just because you've done one thing, and I think the Good Morning Britain is a classic example, the media always, that's life in the media, but you've just got to try again tomorrow, which I know you will, but I think we've just got to try things differently, and it's not just, I mean, obviously the mighty force of the BVA, but it needs to work with others, and I know you are doing that, but we just need to constantly think creatively, especially around the social media world. It's all about that creativity and a bit of luck that will improve us along the way.
I would agree with that entirely, and social media provides a very special challenge because things get whipped up very, very, very quickly, and sometimes reacting to that in a way that's inappropriate can be extremely challenging.
Robin?
Yeah, very quickly, we've talked a bit about getting the messages correct and mixed messages and getting unintended consequences. One of the things I feel very strongly about the importation of dogs from places like Romania, where diseases like rabies are still endemic. But the problem is we've encouraged the public to rehome rather than buy puppies. So, you know, we strongly tell people to rehome. They try to rehome in the UK. There are massive barriers to doing that in many cases, so they do exactly what you were saying, which is they go down the easy route. You know, it's easy to rehome from Romania, and we've told people to rehome. What would you expect? So, you know, we've to some extent created a problem there. And the other one about, just to go back to a wonderful talk that Ben Goldacre gave at BVA Congress, when we were talking about, you know, the anti-vaccination movement. Until what we would call conventional research and the pharmaceutical industry gets its house in order and stops being selective with its data and being found out to be selective with its data, then the people are entitled to be sceptical. And if we create scepticism, we can expect to reap the rewards. So I think we need proper disclosure of research results that don't create a scepticism, which then moves on to, when we defend vaccination, it's simply, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? You know, and that we're banging on a brick wall there until we get the trust of the public back in research in general.
I entirely agree with the second part. And the first part, I'd say, I think actually, and I know the likes of Dogs Trust, Cats Protection, and certainly sort of Red Wings, World Horse Welfare, most people don't rehome from charities because they don't know about that option. So I'm not sure. I think we've all worked very hard in trying to streamline the process of rehoming as much as we can. But nevertheless, clearly it's incumbent on the charity to carry out the appropriate checks and balances. But that's very much a partnership. But I think the biggest challenge is people, partly through the media, find out about Romania before they find out about the local dog centre or cat centre down the road.
Okay, I'm going to start drawing this session towards a close, but I'm going to ask each of the panellists this one question. What one piece of advice would the panellists give to vets and nurses in clinical practice to help them get good health and welfare messages across to clients?
Me?
Yeah. What tool?
Right, so now I have to be very confessional. There's a picture that I usually show when I speak to vets, which happens actually more frequently than I could ever have imagined. And it's a picture of my wife's and my son's dog, Sooty, who is a black Cocker Spaniel, completely untrainable. I do not like dogs. However, in pursuit I do think I have learned from having a dog that I really don't like dogs, but how extraordinarily sentient other animals are. And it's been a very important lesson to me. And I think that in the context of what this discussion that's just taken place, I could say so much. But I think Walt Disney has a great deal to answer for, as does the greetings card industry, because I think that until fairly recently in human history, animals were presented as more threatening and alien rather than members of the family. And the domestication of animals as companion animals, pets, has led to a kind of a belief that they're going to do things and behave in ways which are not how animals behave. And so I think one of the things that vets could possibly do is to try and emphasize to their clients that little Bobby is a dog. And dogs do what dogs do. They don't snuggle up on your beds. They do not sit at breakfast tables eating bowls of cornflakes. They bloody well live outside in a kennel. And actually they behave in doggy kinds of ways. And in that way, they're jolly good things. But not at my kitchen table. No, they don't do it. That doesn't happen. But I do think that's a very important lesson for vets, a thing to try and communicate to beat the Disney industry and the greetings card industry and make sure that people understand their animals are animals and they have a right to exist as animals and they're sentient beings in their own particular way, including chickens, who I do like a lot.
This, of course, coming at a time where we've got more and more pet owners describing themselves as pet parents. But anyway, rolling.
I have to say, I congratulate the Animal Welfare Foundation. I'd love getting to know Tony, but I congratulate the Animal Welfare Foundation finding a speaker who likes looking at people and loos and doesn't like dogs. But my answers are going to be a lot less funny. I think, and I speak as a vet who's never done a day in commercial practice and private practice, but I think the challenge on the clinical vets, and obviously the veterinary profession is much more than just the clinical vets, but just focusing on clinical vets here, I think if we could just, in every consultation, the one word I would say is time, and I know there isn't much time in a clinical consultation, but if one message could be given during that consultation, not relating to the specific clinical case that's in front of them, but something wider around vaccinations, around weight management, around disease control, whatever it be, if just every consultation contained one brief message, I believe that would have a profound effect on animal health and welfare.
Thanks, Rolling.
And I mean, I would give a slightly contrarian response, I suppose, and say that I think one of the key lessons from a lot of our work is that it's not all about information. And we talk a lot about messaging, and of course messaging can do more than just impart information, but I think it's a common misconception to think that we just need to inform people. If you sort of appraise the reasons why people are not doing something you would like them to do or doing something you would like them to not do, it's quite rare that you come across a situation where the key barrier is lack of information. So information can be critical, but it's often not sufficient. And actually two other very important factors are the level of motivation to do something and the ease of doing something. And I think we often don't look at those as much as we look at information. So if you think about motivation, as we heard earlier, it can be useful to tap into some of those kind of more sort of evolutionary construed, deeper motives around pride, fear, disgust, status, etc. And of course, financial motivations are powerful as well. But my number one takeaway would be, if you want to encourage a behaviour, just try and make it easier. So many of our results demonstrate quite profound impacts just from removing frictions and hassles from processes and so on. So if you can get that combination, there's almost this sort of nice curve, sort of relationship between the ease of a behaviour and the level of motivation that's required to see it happen. The more easy you can make something, the less motivation you need to actually do it. So if you can make things easier, try and increase people's motivation a little bit. And yes, information is good, but it's kind of either a requisite but not a sufficiency, or it's a nice to have. It's not, very rarely is it the sort of the only issue at hand. So.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our panel. Thank you.